You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
When Putin talks about Russians, he means a bloodline. He means an ethnicity. This is something impermeable. It's not a community you can leave or become a part of. Either you're born that way or you're not. With us, when he says that the Ukrainians are a part of they're really basically the same, he's tapping into this Tsarist, really 19th, early 20th century notion of belonging that was espoused by the Tsar.
If you like this podcast, can we recommend another one? It's called Big Picture Science. You can hear it wherever you get your podcasts, and its name tells part of the story. The big picture questions and the most interesting research in science.
Seth and I are the hosts. Seth is a scientist. I am Molly, and I'm a science journalist. And we talk to people smarter than us, and we have fun along the way. The show is called Big Picture Science, and as Seth said, you can hear it wherever you get your podcasts.
They didn't have a chance, it seems. It looks like that anyway. Gray, chainmail armored men with helmets in the foreground, confused and lost, barely able to raise their swords. Their general, fallen, lying in the remains of a wrecked wagon. Its wheels are strewn with tattered flags and busted barrels across a dirt road. It's a pitiful scene. A knight tends to him, and as he does, looks up. His eyes meet the point of a spear. In the center, the colors. These yellow horses, these red-shirted and blue-panted equine swordsmen slicing their blades. To the left, 3 men in red, swords in the air. The paintbrush has captured the movement in which they will deliver the simultaneous kills. To the right, a charging spearman with a long beard fells a man who has no time to unsheath his sword. His pain is evident. He clutches his heart. His attacker's horse is still charging, coming for us as we stare at the painting, it almost seems. If this wasn't depicting carnage, it would be a picture of beauty. Azure, magenta, brick red, and turquoise green. In the distance, smoke, fire, horses. You can make out 100 more scenes like the one that we are witnessing. A river in the distance, a little castle. The castle is Zaborov. It's what these men are fighting for, though they are fighting for so much more. The multicolored horsemen are Cossacks. In Turkic language, it refers to free men. And that's what they're fighting for, their freedom. The symbolism is can't miss. The Cossack history of free men on horseback who mounted the stirrups to bring themselves out of serfdom remains embedded today in the conception of Ukrainian history. References to Cossacks are in the national anthem. The national anthem we're now hearing so much is proud. Ukraine is not dead yet. This painting is, and other paintings like it, is all we have of the battle in which the Cossacks surprised and defeated a large army of Poland in 1649. Led by Bogdan Khmelnytsky, leader or hetman of the Hetmanate, a rebel state which controlled Ukraine for 100 years, more than that. From the time of this battle until our own American Revolution, they controlled their own destiny. Cossacks in many cases are peasants, farmers with nothing, turned into horsemen and fighters. But this whole story of the Battle Zaborov starts when this Cossack gets into a dispute with a Polish starosta. Khmelnytsky's farm was raided. He was harassed. It's possible that his wife was abused by the Polish starosta, the local official. His son was beaten up on his farm. He protests, writes an official letter to the government. No one listens. So he meets with other Cossacks, and he raids the local garrison. When other units try to take it back, he's able to fend it off. This revolt takes off from there. Khmelnytsky turns out to be quite a leader of people and is able to assemble a large army. He found out that a large Polish army was coming to reinforce the garrisons that had controlled his area, his country, which we now would call Ukraine. the city of Kyiv, and other cities we're hearing in the news were in this hetman's area. He found out early about the reinforcements arriving and designed to attack the reinforcements directly, splitting the Polish army in two. He was allied, sort of, with Tatars, Muslims from the south, from the Crimean area, and surprised the Polish army by hiding the bulk of his army behind a hill and attacking as they crossed a river. The Polish army was about to be decimated, and only because the allies, the Tatars of these Cossacks, insisted on signing a peace deal did they accept entreaties from the Polish army, from the King of Poland, to do a treaty, and forces Poland to agree to grant independence to the Hemanate. Khmelnytsky's name remains in a city in Ukraine, and his picture adorns Ukrainian banknotes. There are statues of him as well. It wouldn't be so easy even after the battle if he would have battles with his own Muslim Tatars. They didn't turn out to be such reliable allies. They were a force multiplier in the battle, certainly, kept betraying the Cossacks. All of these events, yes, they were long ago, and it's not unremoved from what's going on today with Russia's horrific invasion.
Ukraine tends to be in the middle of things. And it's gone back and forth. So you go back to like Kiev and Rus, you go back to, over 1,000 years ago.
We talked with Dr. Ben Sawyer of Middle Tennessee State University. He's also the host, along with Bob Crawford, of the Road to Now podcast. And by the way, if you're not listening to that, you should. He's an expert in Russian studies, Ukrainian studies, and he's got an article in the Washington Post. Look out for that.
Where, you have this narrative again that begins there that is claimed to unite the Russians, the Belarusians, and the Ukrainians. Then you have the Mongol invasion in the 1240s. It's a long story here. The issue of nationalism really complicated there, because when you get this creation of this ethnic nationality and nationalism as a story, as a way of defining a community, it comes in the 19th century. It's all about defining a clear language. It's all about defining a clear narrative that is distinct. You have, national tragedy, things like this. So when you look at like what this looks like when it comes to Ukraine, first of all, you've got a lot of peasants there, and you go to them with some kind of a romantic 19th century story. They're, okay, but farmers don't leave very far from where they're from, and peasants certainly don't. Most of the non-Ukrainians they talk to are going to be Russians or Poles. A lot of their relationships, if you're a peasant, with those folks is that they extract wealth from you, right? So they own your land. So there's a tense relationship there. And so this idea of nationalism doesn't really stick there because you have so many communities that are so overlapping. And because language and literature and all this creation is what's needed to create a notion of nationalism, illiterate people, it's hard to bring them in on that. But Ukraine itself is divided. I mean, you have portions of it that were part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, right? That then fall, Western Ukraine, where Lviv is now. You have it going back and forth. Poland claims it for a minute, then it comes back into Ukraine. You've got portions in the eastern part of the country that are ethnically Russian. So you just have this mix there. And what Putin is trying to say now is he's like, well, no, it doesn't matter. Everyone there is Slavic. If you're Ukrainian, you're part of the Russian story. Ukrainians have been trying to create their own story. And again, it didn't stick as hard there as in a lot of other places.
Everything about Ukraine and its history right now is contested. You'll see battles on Quora, not so much now, but leading up to the invasion, from people saying, Russians saying to Ukrainians, name one thing that the Ukrainians did without Russia. And Ukrainians saying back that we were the force behind the Soviet Union, and all of these famous people come from there. Even the name Ukraine is contested, as Ben talks about.
Ukraine in Ukrainian, Ukraina in Russian. The origins of the word are like somewhat murky, but the generally understood origin of the name Ukraine, it goes to the root word in Russian, krai, means edge of something. Ukraina, the Russian word, it's why Ukrainians don't like the in front of Ukraine, because Ukraine is one thing, the Ukraine, right? So in Russian, there's two ways you can put it. V Ukraine, which means in Ukraine, but then another way you'll hear people say is na Ukraine, which means on the Ukraine. and that root word krai being on the edge. If you say the Ukraine, it evokes that edge notion. And as you know this, if you're going to have a periphery, you have to have a center. And in that center, it's Russia. So it's almost like they're not a legitimate country. They're just the edge of this Russian empire, the Slavic world.
These events that we described and the Cossack Revolution so long ago that while Cossacks and Ruthenian peasants are fighting for their freedom on the steppe, the Dutch still held New Amsterdam at this time in modern-day New York City. Philadelphia didn't exist. The Dutch were battling with Swedes over who would start a colony in that area. Rhode Island was just now separating church and state in its laws. Maryland was developing tolerance of other religions officially, while Massachusetts was cracking down on heresy. And Charles Stuart, the King of England, lost his head. Virginia colony in America remained loyal to the Stuarts and not to Oliver Cromwell until a ship arrived in Virginia and forced them. This is all going on as the Hemonite is established in the Ukraine area, and it would have its troubles with its allies, and another second Polish invasion would take back more lands. Without allies, Khmelnytsky would be forced to make a decision, one that is directly talked about in the events of today. These events are of supreme importance to a long-bearded, bookish fellow named Mikhailo Hrushevsky in the 1880s. His weapon is not a horse, nor a sword, nor a spear, but a pen. And he compiles his 10-volume history of the Ukraine in the 1880s.
Histories and people are products of their times. And certainly at the era of nationalism, these authors are going to be trying to use history to differentiate Ukraine from other sides, from other ones, because they want to create this distinct identity. And this is why history is so important for the creation of identities, the creation of belonging, communities. It tells a story. Here's the story. Here are the highlights. Here's how we're here.
He wanted to tell the story of his country, not from the point of view of all the various people who owned it or conquered it. Poles, Austrians, Germans, Russians, but the people who lived there, the Kievan Rus, who were reduced and conquered by the Mongols, and of course the Cossacks we discussed. Ukrainians, he said, were always fighting for Ukraine, for a nation, not for religion and not for class, as other historians asserted. They were fighting for free land. In the 1890s, Hrushevsky becomes a politician too, arguing for independence. Here's him in 1918, writing in the New York Times. The Cossacks did not hesitate to proclaim their immunity from all jurisdiction to all foreign sovereignty, all taxes, all personal service of those who had submitted to the power and jurisdiction of the Zaporozh, or the Cossack army. In other words, Cossacks offered freedom from the heavy burdens of serfdom. It is what the historian isolates as a Ukrainian moment. But Hrushevsky is not popular in Russia. His interpretation is not. He wasn't popular then, though he's accepted and worshipped in Ukraine. His picture appears on Ukrainian money, just like the hetman, Khmelnytsky, does. There are statues of him in Kyiv. He's prosecuted by the Tsar of Russia, who arrests him and sends him to Siberia. His crime? How he interpreted the events of the 1650s. But back to our hetman, the Cossack, Khmelnytsky. His free nation could not, in his estimation, last long on its own. There were simply too many countries surrounding it. And the Crimean Tatars, which we had mentioned, that helped battle the Poles, were just not reliable. He must make a choice. His nation is mostly Orthodox in terms of religion. He's surrounded by Turks, Poles, Russians, Austrians, Moldavians. He decides to side with what's then called Muscovy in Moscow. But we would know that nation, and it's soon to be Russia. There's a treaty signed in 1654. This obscure treaty still matters very much in 2022. It's referenced by a would-be historian of Vladimir Putin in a Russian media source on a website. It's concrete evidence for Russians from Catherine the Great to Vladimir Putin that the Cossacks, the Ukrainians, signed away their sovereignty to Russia in exchange for protection. That's not the way Hrushevsky sees it. Writing in 1918, he's been released after the October 1917 revolution, and Ukrainians are part of that revolution. He refers to the treaty. These articles were drawn up in haste, without going deeply into the problem. Many questions were left undecided. He says the pourparlers, or the discussions prior to the negotiations, which still exist, the treaty, there's no copy of it that exists, but the pourparlers do exist, say that Khmelnytsky was agreeing to whatever concessions to provide Muscovy as an ally to go to war with Poland. Some see it as an establishment of a union, he says, some a theoretical one. So the argument is, either it's kind of a treaty to have a common purpose in going to war, or it's a treaty giving away your sovereignty. By the 1780s, when Catherine the Great is in charge of Russia, she'll completely bring Ukraine into Russia. The various czars will continue that. And then you get into, here's Mikhail Zygar's The Empire Must Die. We had Mikhail Zygar on in 2017, and I finally got around to finishing his large book on the Russian Revolution. A serious problem is brewing between Kiev and Petrograd, and this is in July 1917. Russia has thrown off the Tsar has abdicated, and now a provisional government, ostensibly of Democrats, of a mixture of business leaders, some right-wing former military people, the Bolsheviks, and socialists, have formed a provisional government. And until October 17, when the Bolsheviks take over, it will run Russia, more or less. A serious problem is brewing between Kyiv and Petrograd. For several months, the Central Rada has been developing plans for Ukrainian autonomy. On the 16th of May, a Ukrainian delegation headed by Volodymyr Vinnichenko had traveled to Petrograd, but it was not received by any ministers. The Ukrainian question was postponed until the convocation of the Constituent Assembly. Kyiv opts for more decisive action. In early June, at the height of mobilization and contrary to a ban imposed by the provisional government, the first all-Ukrainian military congress is held in Kyiv, at which the creation of a separate Ukrainian army is put forward as a key demand. At the same time, the Central Rada publishes the first universal, the main policy document and manifesto of the new Ukraine. It is a constitution in everything but name.
The Bolsheviks come in with a whole new story about the way the world works. And at a time when World War I has brought the Russian Empire to its knees. And so much to the point that you have incredible losses. You have people going off to die. You have shortages of food. People are so desperate that they go out and risk their lives to overthrow the Tsar, who has ultimate power. I mean, it's kind of an insane point. The Bolsheviks get in power and they make sure their people are the ones at the top.
And there you have it. Confusing history that goes on, and it's certainly something that's able to be exploited by the various players. I talked with Ben Sawyer, and we're going to have an extensive talk about all of these things. And I'm here with Dr. Ben Sawyer. He is from Middle Tennessee State University. Also, most importantly, he is on the Road to Now podcast with Bob Crawford. Now, you already listened to that because I've told you to listen to that. And if I tell you to listen to a podcast, you need to do it. I'm not a dictator, but in this instance, I am.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Happy to be on the beneficial end of your benevolent dictatorship, Bruce.
Listen, I wanted to have you on, Ben, because I'm not as much an expert on these things, although I'm at work, as we discussed with my Soviet Union podcast coming later in the year. But the events now, have come and they're moving at a fast pace. I am not an expert. Ben is the expert. You have studied, right? You've been to Ukraine. You've been to Russia.
Yeah, I'm primarily in Russia. Spent about the better part of 2 years of my life there, and I went there various times aside from that. But yeah, basically from the end of summer of 2010 to the end of summer 2012, my life was centered and lived mostly in Russia, but did visit Ukraine a couple of times. Went to Odessa. Spent a day in Kyiv, but spent several days in Odessa, which is the southern part right now on the Black Sea, which a lot of you guys are hearing about now. It's an old city, but my major field is in Soviet history. I'm someone whose research focuses primarily on the economics of things. I'm interested in exchanges, basically like the history of economic systems and the creation of a communist and capitalist world and how they interact. But you can't study the Soviet Union without understanding nationalities policy and ethnicity. You can't live there either without understanding these things, because they very much matter in shaping the history of Russia, the Soviet Union, and Ukraine, all the former Soviet republics, and people's everyday lives. They matter a lot.
I'm not sure that people know how much the current war that's going on has to do with history. For instance, last year, Vladimir Putin played historian, writing an article on with his interpretation of the history, and whispered in George W. Bush's ear that there is no Ukraine. It's not a real country. He comes from the Soviet Union, and I think there's a lot of this battle that's going on is over nationality.
It is. Can I just start off by saying I would be incredibly hesitant to get my history from politicians.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the thing. I mean, it's all about a story, right? And
even the ones that you like, it's like, you didn't totally get that right.
No, I mean, because when you let a politician tell you a story, it generally concludes with the notion that you should support them. And politicians are storytellers.
But it's funny because at the end of it, not to say anything with Putin say right now is funny, but it is interesting because at the end of the article, he has this whole historical, methodology discussion where it's like, I get my statements here from open sourced and not secret meetings and secret facts.
The interesting thing is like, hey, you know what? It's like, I'm not an alcoholic unlike some people. And you're like, what are you saying? But yeah, I mean, I would say that Putin certainly is better at projecting the idea of objectivity than most politicians are. He's not actually being objective, but he does a better job of sounding like a scholar than most American politicians are like, freedom, this country, the founding fathers, the Constitution, blah. And they just it's just kind of amorphous, symbology. Yeah, I mean, he does tap into, I mean, he gets at some things that are real in the past, and he does go through in his story, but really it's a narrative that he is trying to project and tell. And this is where I think it's important. If you want to understand any of this, you've got to understand that communities are based around stories, and legitimacy within those communities is based upon, as it is now. I mean, the reason politicians use history all the time is because it's a force of legitimizing one's actions. If you need to have the population behind you, you need to tell a story that's convincing to them. I don't know. I'll say here right now, I don't know that Putin's new story that he's broken out recently is that convincing to a lot of people. But yeah, you go back to it, and what he's getting at here, and where he overlaps with some debates historians are actually having, is this question of the formation of nationality and its origins. It's messy. And so, first of all, for most Americans, I think one of the biggest problems they have understanding this is that we see nationalism very differently. We have a civic nationalism. For us, our belonging in the United States. Now, this doesn't always pan out like this, but I think its origins, I mean, our founding documents they're not ethnic documents. They're documents about principles. They're Enlightenment documents, which was, I think, fascinatingly enough, a rejection of the bloodline notion of belonging as was practiced under empire. I mean, you have a monarch, and the monarch's entire legitimacy is based upon a blood claim that their father birthed them, and that their blood is therefore the revelation of God's will. We reject that, and we reject that at a pretty interesting time, because it's at a moment where the Enlightenment leads to a rejection. The reasoning leads to a rejection of that bloodline, but before what happens in the 19th century, which is the creation of a new story that is nationalist and is ethnic in this ethnic way. So ethnicity ends up becoming really important to folks in Eastern Europe, and that's a gap. When Putin talks about Russians, he means a bloodline. He means an ethnicity. This is something impermeable. It's not a community you can leave or become a part of. Either you're born that way or you're not. With us, when he says that the Ukrainians are a part of they're really basically the same, he's tapping into this Tsarist, really 19th, early 20th century notion of belonging that was espoused by the Tsar, which was that Slavic people are all one community. And within that, you have the tight connection between the Russians. So you have Russia, Belarusia, so Russia, Belarusia, and Malorussia, which means Little Russia, and that's what they called Ukraine. And so when he's basing these claims on it, what he's saying is this is an immutable, primordial belonging. You are, and this is the problem. Therefore, in his story, Ukrainians don't have the right to leave.
If you turn it around, and I think the Ukrainians right now are trying to do that. It's like, okay, let's say we're one country. Guess whose money and whose economy they're going to be using? There'd be a yellow and blue flag over Moscow right now. We have a better economy. We're stronger. You could argue that Ukraine was always a part of the Soviet Union, was always a functioning member of the Soviet Union. A lot of the energy, certainly the wheat production.
There are really many reasons to listen to our podcast, Big Picture Science. It's kind of a challenge to summarize them all, Molly.
Okay, here's a reason to listen to our show, Big Picture Science, because you love to be surprised by science news. We love to be surprised by science news. So, for instance, I learned on our own show that I had been driving around with precious metals in my truck before it was stolen.
That was brought up in our show about precious metals and also rare metals, like most of the things in your catalytic converter. I was surprised to learn that we may begin naming heat waves like we do hurricanes. You know, prepare yourself for heat wave Lucifer.
I don't think I can prepare myself for that.
Look, we like surprising our listeners. We like surprising ourselves by reporting new developments in science and while asking the big picture questions about why they matter and how they will affect our lives today and in the future.
Well, we can't affect lives in the past, right?
Oh, I guess that's a point. So the podcast is called Big Picture Science, and you can hear it wherever you get your podcasts.
We are the hosts. Seth is a scientist. I'm a science journalist, and we talk to people smarter than us. We hope you'll take a listen.
Hutchinson, Minnesota had some problems. For the adults of Hutchinson, the problem was the teenagers. They kept sneaking off at night to empty barns where they'd, brace yourself, dance. Who knew what sort of sin and heavy petting and French literature these barn dances might lead to? No, the adults of Hutchinson, Minnesota did not approve. And neither, it seemed, did the devil. One summer night, Satan himself suddenly appeared in the middle of the dance floor, and the debauched teens ran in fear. He showed up at the next dance, too. For a few months, it seemed like you couldn't go to a late-night barn dance in Hutchinson without getting chased out by the devil, pitchfork in tow. Until one night, when a 14-year-old boy had the good sense to shoot him in the chest. At which point the devil was revealed, Scooby-Doo style but bloodier, to be the local Methodist minister, dressed in a costume and flown in from the roof by rope and pulley. This is The Constant, a history of getting things wrong. I'm Mark Chrysler. Every episode, we look at the accidents, mistakes, and bad ideas that helped misshape our world. Find us at constantpodcast.com or wherever you get your podcasts.
The collision that you're seeing here is Putin asserting, and this is the big break. Putin had always used these ethnic tensions to edge in. He has a long history of exploiting this, whether in Chechnya, whether in Georgia, with the Abkhazians and the South Ossetians there. This is why it's surprising to me, because he had always played a story that was about nationality, but it looked like a modern notion of nationality. Right? There are Russians, there are Belarusians, there are Ukrainians. And of course, that relationship's a bit. The history there makes them have more in common. But what we saw when he went for Kiev was like a complete reversion to like a Tsarist era notion of like what the national belonging is. Russian and Ukrainian, these are like modern nationalities. This is why it's such a incredibly shocking thing to see, that going for Kiev, which nobody expected. Well, not nobody. I think Americans did, but.
I just come off reading The Empire Must Die, Zygar. He's the head of Rain TV, and I had him on the show, and I just finished reading his giant book. And he kind of makes this point, though, that like Putin and the current Russia is more similar to Tsarist Russia, pre-Soviet, and than even the Soviet. We always think like, Putin wants to bring the Soviet Union back. And I think there's elements where that might be, but it's actually... having oligarchs, targeting journalists, playing ethnicities, and that's a lot of Tsarist stuff.
But Bruce, let me go back on this. I think most people who study the Soviet Union and are familiar with Russia always found that claim that he was trying to bring the Soviet Union back laughable.
Uh-huh.
I mean, it comes out of a statement he made a while back that the collapse of the Soviet
things were better during.
The collapse of the Soviet Union was like one of the greatest historical tragedies, like in something like this, right? And then people go, he wants to bring it back. To say that and to refer to what's happening now as a Cold War, to me, you have to be so unaware of what made those things what they were. Like, for example, let me just lay this out. This would be easy. It's incredibly Eurocentric. Because you say he wants to bring back the Soviet Union. Why? Because he's going and taking Ukraine. He wants to take Ukraine and Belarus. Yeah, you think he wants Turkmenistan back? You think he's trying to take Tajikistan? Right? Is he going in trying to reclaim Azerbaijan? The Soviet Union was so much larger than these European republics, and they were certainly an important part of it. But you can't imagine that. Nobody even thinks that. Second of all, the Cold War was about ideology, and the ideology of the Cold War. The way I just recently broke this down to my students is if you want to look at World War II and kind of unite these diverse ideologies into camps, seems like the U.S. and the Soviet Union being on the same side would be surprising because you go, well, they've got opposing views of opposing stories. Yeah, and the same thing with the Germans and the Japanese. How do you unite them? And the way I put it is, the Germans, the Italians, and the Japanese are united in that the future they are imagining and fighting for is a future based on bloodline. And the United States, the British, the French, and the Soviets all are fighting for a future based upon something else. They're not bound. It's not bound to bloodline. Even the Soviets, their vision of the future is based in class.
Great way to look at it. I mean, during World War II, London had like 12 exiled governments.
Yes, it did.
In it, it was definitely international city, and of course, what America is and what all the Americas are, nations of immigrants. And then Russia, for all the Soviet Union's fault, the one thing that they did, well or badly, we could debate that, and I'll have podcasts coming out on that, is, like you say, so many of these ethnic groups. You could walk on Moscow in any day in like 1981 and speak 100 languages and see all kinds of different groups, and everything from Inuits to Tajiks and
Armenians, Uzbeks, Koreans.
Who knows if everybody was really equal and stuff. At least on paper, there were some attempts to say, hey, you got to share the jobs and make sure everyone has housing and stuff like that.
Yeah, Arnie Westad, his book on the Cold War, his first one, The Global Cold War, I think is what it's called. But Arnie Westad is a great historian, and he lays out this book on the Global Cold War and he says, what the U.S. and the Soviet Union are selling at the end of the day is they both claim to be the group that are fulfilling the Enlightenment promise and fulfilling a world in which everyone is at their best, everyone has their rights fulfilled, and that they're that they're at the top. This is completely absent right now. There is no promise that everyone will benefit from what's happening. This is old school 19th century imperialism in which one group goes, we want this, we're going to take this. Putin's not claiming that everyone in the world will be better off if he wins. And that to me is a substantial difference. This is empire. This is I'll take this, you take that. And
I think
that
that's
to me
great,
is why the Cold War parallel is a problem.
You're giving people like a great I think that's great. You're giving people like a great preview of some things that I have for the Soviet cast coming on that a lot of Soviet citizens believed in the dream. It wasn't all like we thought it was all brainwashing, but cutting back to Ukraine a bit, and I want to go a little bit deep in the history if we feel like it. Grushevsky, the Ukrainian historian, and while he's just a guy, and he also was a politician around the time of the beginning of the Soviet Union in Ukraine, but he was one that brought it back to, and he had a 10-volume history of Ukraine that came out in the 1880s and finished it up in the 1920s, and before he got, of course, like everyone in the Soviet Union, then had an independent thought banned and exiled at least to Moscow. But he takes it back to the Cossack era in the 1640s, and Khmelnytsky, if I have that right, and his fights with the Poles, and having a nation of Ukraine that at that moment was neither Russia nor Poland nor the Ottomans, but worked with all three, but had this separate identity, freeing peasants and putting them on horseback and turning them into free Cossacks or free men. Of course, that brings up the history that at some point Khmelnytsky had to sign a treaty with Russia in order to make himself stronger in opposing Poland. And so you see two sides of that. For the Ukrainian historians, it's like, yeah, that's a temporary, that's just like we had an alliance, US had an alliance with France. That's all that is. And then for the Russian historians, including that historian Putin, it's like that's when they signed with Russia and became part of Russia. And from that point. So I don't know anything to say on that, on the kind of the Cossack era.
So this is the issue. I mean, to me, history in this region is a contested battleground. It depends on what you want to say and what you want to remain silent about. The question to me now comes like, okay, so Putin's claim that the borders of modern Ukraine were negotiated early on by the Soviets. That's true. I mean, as a modern state, that's, that's unquestionable.
But when you say the Soviets, guess what? Ukraine, when you say, like, people are like, oh, it's determined by the Soviets. Right. That doesn't mean the Russians. That means the Soviets, of which Ukraine is a part. Khrushchev and Brezhnev, they're from the Ukrainian party.
Yeah, so like they're from there, but that doesn't mean they represent the overall sentiment. Mm-hmm. And this is the thing, and with a lot of this, when I wrote my master's thesis, finished in 2005 at Appalachian State, wrote it on the Russian Civil War in Siberia, and it's funny in the South, right? I'm like, they're like, what are you working on? I'm like, I'm writing about the Russian Civil War in Siberia, and people are like, I've always thought that if Lee had more soldiers, I'm like, there's more than one Civil War. The South just always thought I was like, I didn't know it went all the way to Siberia. So this is one of the problems the Bolsheviks have, is that, I mean, really, this is a battle of stories. The Bolsheviks come in with a whole new story about the way the world works, and at a time when World War I has brought the Russian Empire to its knees. And so much to the point that you have incredible losses. You have people going off to die. You have shortages of food. People are so desperate that they go out and risk their lives to overthrow the Tsar, who has ultimate power. I mean, it's kind of an insane point. But what you end up with is a civil war that happens really from 1918. People say 21. That's kind of when the bigger parts are. You still have like the rebels in Central Asia fighting to the 1920s. You have, I mean, there's all these elements, but to keep it neat, 21. And the fascinating thing is that in Siberia, totally other side of things, you had these Czechoslovak soldiers who had been fighting for independence. They had left the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a lot of them, and surrendered, and then were reformed into their own fighting brigades. And then Trotsky was worried that they were going to, because once the Bolsheviks take over and pull Russia out of the war, in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in early 1918, these Czechoslovaks are pretty mad because a lot of people think that the Russians are now siding with the Germans. They think there's an alliance there because, of course, the Germans helped Lenin get back. All this things is conspiratorial thinking. But Trotsky has them. He's like, how are we going to get these people out of here? Because we can't keep them here, right? Because they're well-trained soldiers. They could be a problem. He's like, also, we can't send them like if we help them get back really quick, the Germans are going to be mad at us. That's a whole issue. How do we get them across Europe? So they actually send them from the eastern part of the empire, from the western part of the Russian Empire, across the Trans-Siberian Railroad. And they're going to send them out of Vladivostok across to the United States. They're then going to traverse the United States and go back to the other side of back to Europe to fight on the Western Front. And now, as they're going through in the Civil War, there are all these factions that are fighting, right? There are the Siberian, Siberian parties. There are the Bolsheviks. There are the white armies. There are all these groups. And I tried, at the point I couldn't read Russian. I couldn't as very well. I couldn't get to Russia. So I was like, what sources can I find? And I found some good primary sources that have been translated and all this. But I remember thinking, man, this is supposed to be this huge revolution where everyone is involved in it, right? Everything's at stake. But by and large, the peasants in Siberia, you know what they want? They just want to be left alone. So like when the Bolsheviks first show up, they're like, oh yeah, cool. You're going to help us get rid of the Tsarist imperial officers. Cool. They take a bunch of our stuff. And a lot of us actually fled illegally. So we're running from them. We're with you. But they don't imagine a new government's going to come in place. They just kind of go, okay, cool. We're going to get rid of the Russian Empire. They don't want anything new. And one of my advisors who works on Mexican history, he made this point, and this is where I'm going to bring it back to Ukraine. He said, yeah, that's the thing. Peasants just want to be left alone. Peasants just want, their relationship with the state is never good. They just want to be left alone to do what they want to do. Your stories you come in here with, okay, whatever. I'm a farmer. Like, I know the people in my community. That's all I'm worried about. And that's what happens in Ukraine too. Because there's not a huge nationalist movement outside of the cities. the Bolsheviks at first, a lot of Ukrainians are like, cool. Same thing with the Germans. When the Germans actually take most of Ukraine in that treaty of Brest-Litovsk, where it looks like the Germans are coming in there, the Germans kind of help prop up a Ukrainian state. And they're like, cool, but then they realize that the Germans are just there to extract wealth from them. So they're like, yeah, no good. Then the Bolsheviks come in, and a lot of the peasants are like, oh, good, the Bolsheviks are going to help us get rid of the Germans. And so they're like, cool with them first until the Bolsheviks begin extracting wealth from them. And so at the end of the day, they just want to be largely left alone. But it is this relationship with outsiders that helps form nationalism, helps form the notion of a nation. Because let me put this in an easy way you can understand, Bruce. I never thought of myself as much of a Southerner when I lived in the South. It was only when I left the South that I realized that I was a Southerner, because everyone reminded me of that.
I think I understand.
Does it make sense? And when you're just at home, you're just like, well, I'm just trying to feed myself. It's when you have this direct engagement constantly with outside groups that you begin to think of yourself as different.
It does work the other way as well. I think I was 30 minutes into a visit in Texas before the Y word came out,
Oh, yeah.
The Yankee. Yeah. I mean, we don't call each other that. It's a baseball team up here. There's nobody uses that term.
Well, down here, people from California are Yankees. It's a bizarre thing.
In England, we're all Yankees, just to finish.
Yeah.
Okay.
But it comes back to this fact that like you create a sense of identity there. That doesn't necessarily mean it's one thing.
In the Ukraine instance, who are the foreign influences kind of creating a Ukraine sense of being or what have you?
Well, it's so the sense of like separation, the sense of us and them. I mean, this comes with like basically your relationship with any other group of outsiders being a negative, right?
Gotcha.
Because they own the land.
Gotcha.
I mean, basically your relationship with people who come from outside your community into your community is largely that they're there to take things from you by force. So that separates a distinct us and them. All over the Soviet Union, it's different in each republic. But the issue becomes that the Bolsheviks early on, their ideology is that nationalism is all just a farce of the bourgeoisie to divide and conquer, right? World War I is this manifestation of that to them. It's all, in their mind, they're like, it's a bunch of poor people in trenches killing each other, being told that they're different. Mm-hmm. But in reality, once they see that class is really what creates identity, then we'll just jump over that, right? So, that's the whole call during World War I. The Bolsheviks are saying, get over this. They're Germans. You're Anglo-Saxons. Who cares? You're all poor. And that's why it becomes a compelling case for a lot of Russians. So you have this reformation of identity. The problem is the Bolsheviks can't get people to believe that because nobody's really working class outside of the cities. So then how do you create the Marxist dialectic with peasants? And what they believe they can do is they can use, like they can entwine, they then make this weird turn where they institutionalize nations and bring in ethnographers and these experts who are, again, thinking in national categories to then create a national identity, because they reach the conclusion that you got to get that national identity first so that you can understand the world in that terms. Like that. So basically nationality substitutes itself for the real experience of class. So it's really enforced through official Bolshevik policy. Language and like national heroes and all this are enforced on the idea you'll jump over it.
You had to carry it around in your passport. Well,
and the idea is this will allow you to jump over that and get to the class part. And it obviously we get stuck in that first part. But that's why it is why it's fair to say that in a lot of ways, less to extent in Ukraine where you do have national figures. But my God, in Central Asia, basically the Bolsheviks draw lines around there and they're like, you're Cossacks now. You're Uzbeks now. Tajikistan's a little bit easier because Tajiks speak a Persian-based language, right? So they've got that. But then even the issue of control over Samarkand, right? It's ethnically overlapped. But then they use this and be like, here's what you are. And they try to create these nationalities. And so it's true that there are the creation of these nationalities through Soviet official policy. Now, the question to me is, and the problem I have with Putin is then, yeah, okay, so that might be a correct story. Certainly he's embellishing in some cases. But are we then bound to, if we say that was a state-sponsored creation of identity, does that mean that we now get to follow yours?
Right. It's a legitimate question. Even if you were right that this was part of the Soviet Union, it was connected to Russia, for 30 years, it hasn't been. So what does that mean? Doesn't that mean anything? We're in a modern world. You don't You don't attack countries, right? I mean, there's just whatever happened to that New World Order, right? I guess the message didn't get around.
And we helped create some of this, with the national self-determination in Europe. The thing that if you get these categories, again, as they exist, as let's say there's like a way that these national categories are allowed to exist legitimately, and that we kind of are fine with them. Like, this is where this thing well, not we, but like the world kind of accepts this principle, right? This was how this conflict went down early on. And I said earlier, talking about Putin's long history of exploiting ethnic difference in ways that were advantageous. They all played by a general understanding, like the other side's understanding of who they were. So like, he didn't go to Abkhazia and be like, you're Russians now. He used the conflict with the Georgian Republic with Abkhazia and South Ossetia to justify an intervention. He then went into those areas, cleared out Georgian forces, and then began slowly advancing towards Tbilisi. There were some airstrikes around Tbilisi, but basically went in. Now he's legitimized. We're helping out the people. This is the story, right? We're helping out these nations. And then allowed, very shortly after, without going and bombing Tbilisi or heading straight for Tbilisi, allowed the French to negotiate a treaty that Putin got what he wanted. It was and the world goes, and then France negotiates. They go, okay, we're going to work this out. We don't think it's right, but there's some, in the modern consciousness, some legitimacy to being like, that's an ethnic group. Okay, whatever. It's in other words, it's rules that people understand whether or not they accept the action.
Oh my God. I mean, it has everything to do with World War II and Czechoslovakia and the Munich Agreement, everything to do with that. Same arguments, not a real country, just created at the peace table, two countries melded together. I mean, yeah, you certainly has everything to do with the war in Yugoslavia. I mean, you do have to be careful about our acceptance of these terms.
Yeah, I think this is why certainly those of us who study Russia, and why Western Europe, in Central Europe, a place where people understand national categories a little better. Like I said, going back to this, we as Americans have a civic nationality. Our borders are our community. That is something that so when we think of borders as essential to create our community, birthright citizenship, right? If you're born inside of our borders, you are an American citizen. That's how we mark it. It's not based on race. It's not based on any of these things. Although I would say, we have tried. There have been people who have tried. You go back to Dred Scott, that decision, and you look at what the Confederacy was. I would make a strong argument the Confederacy was an attempt to create an ethnic nation within the United States. We rejected that. This modern day, we don't think like that.
Right.
So when Putin goes with the 2014, right, the seizing Crimea and then supporting these breakaway republics of Luhansk and Donetsk. Like, that's not cool. But to a lot of the world, like, it certainly hurt Putin's reputation. But if you want to ask why he didn't totally lose out on all foreign involvement or, relations with like Germany and France, it's because he was playing by rules that had been kind of established. Whether you accept them or not, people knew. He was saying the people who live in those areas are ethnic Russians. To the United States, we say that's a state border. But the border of the nation does not follow state borders. So he's saying the community that I am asserting myself to is an ethnic nation, not the state. That's why I think every one of us and people in Western Germany, remember, we were freaking out. The United States was freaking out about this, about what was happening with Putin surrounding the country. Western Europe was not as much. I mean, they were not cool with it, but they were not as much because they thought what I think most scholars of the area thought. He was going to use this threat to annex or to push further into these ethnic Russian majority areas. That would have followed script because he's making the claim of the nation. When he went for Kyiv, that was where everything fell apart because that didn't follow a script anybody quite understood. Why do you go for the capital? And you could have very easily done in Ukraine what you did in Georgia. You move in, you fully occupy the areas you want to break away, and then you slowly move towards Kyiv. And at that point, you've got an out. At that point, you go, somebody negotiated into this. And you have not an embrace of it, but probably a willingness in Western Europe to see far more, okay, we'll end this, that'll end the war, you'll get this.
Hello, this is Matt from the Explorers Podcast. I want to invite you to join me on the voyages and journeys of the most famous explorers in the history of the world. At the Explorers Podcast, we plunge into jungles and deserts, across mighty oceans and frigid ice caps, over and to the top of great mountains, and even into outer space. These are the thrilling and captivating stories of Magellan, Shackleton, Lewis and Clark, and so many other famous and not so famous adventurers from throughout history. So come give us a listen. We'd love to have you. Go to explorerspodcast.com or just look us up on your podcast app. That's the Explorers Podcast.
I mean, you got a lot of theories. There's the old overused three-dimensional chess. He had already, in his mind, worked out that play where he could have threatened Kyiv to get the Donbass, and knowing that he could do that, goes for the extra because he already played that out in his head and knew what Europe and NATO would do already, and so he went for the extra. The other theory you're hearing a lot of is like that Putin's getting older, the regime's getting older, there's maybe not a lot of thinking going on. And then the third is that maybe I'm not going to use any of the President Trump's language about this is what a move or whatever, but maybe that it's right in line with a larger plan that actually wants to go for a new world order and really upset things.
Right. And again, I could be wrong about this, but I think that the old playbook, I mean, if he pulls the playbook out of Georgia where you're going to have far friendlier interactions with people not totally friendly, but your local, the resources it takes to hold down Donetsk and Luhansk after moving in where you've already got a strong presence. That's pretty easy. It's an easy win. You then move towards Kyiv again, saying, we'll negotiate an end to this, right? And then you kind of say, you put pressure from Western Europe on this to be like, hey, you got to end this war, right? Now they might not like it, but you say, if you don't accept this, it could lead to something worse. You play people off each other. But did you hear about this article that came out for a minute, like the Saturday after the invasion? That was launched by like TASS and RIA, like all of these.
No, I don't think so.
This to me is key. It came out and it basically auto-launched, I think like 3 p.m. Moscow time on the big state. And it was quickly taken down. But it was somebody saved it, like the Wayback Machine caught it. Like I think one of the organizations kept it up a little bit longer. But the article was called Nastuplenie Россия в Нового мира. And what it means is the Russian offensive in the New World. And it was written from the perspective, and this is why it was like, it's almost like this whole thing was on a launch. Remember Putin gave that talk the day before about it, and then he announced the invasion, but everybody was like, he's wearing the same clothes. He pre-recorded this when they announced the invasion. It's like almost like a social media campaign, like where he had everything set up to go in order.
This is our first large social media war.
Yeah, well, if that's the case, as I think it is, Putin had expected that Ukraine would fall very quickly. Because this article that came out and was quickly revoked is written from the perspective of a very successful campaign to take Ukraine. And in it, the author, this is almost certainly official state propaganda, if it's like auto launching on all these things. The author's like, basically, let us explain to you what we did here. We freed Ukraine from its fascist overlords, and we have unleashed a new era. And they say in this, an era in which Russia, Belarusia, and Malorussia have been restored and shall provide a new balance of power in the world. It's a statement that is based in this new nationalist story that is really kind of, you call it neo-Tsarism. And it's written from that perspective. And it says, we have created this world. This is a whole new ideology. And this helps explain why he went for Kiev. Putin might actually be, I don't think Putin, I think it's laughable to say he's trying to establish a new Soviet Union for all the reasons that I've explained before. But what he might be trying to do is establish a new Tsarist empire.
I think you couldn't be wrong. And we're not going to get the universal work and universal housing and benefits of a communal Soviet Union. He doesn't care about that. In fact, he's quite the opposite. He wouldn't be in power if that existed in the same way. But the borders would be nice, particularly the European borders. He wouldn't mind if he could get it. I think you get Ukraine, Poland's threatened, Romania's threatened. Moldavia seems like a goner if he was able to move faster. Were you, like everyone, kind of surprised by the resistance, how strong it's been?
Let me say this. I'm not surprised by how strong the resistance has been. I'm surprised by how effective it's been.
Okay.
Because this is the thing. Again, it's like you're saying they're not trying to recruit people, right? I mean, ethnic nationalism does not proselytize because it's not expansive. Right. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is the thing. Communism, capitalism, all these concepts, they're proselytizing ideologies, not ethnic nationalism. You're in it or you're not. And this is the problem. The conflict that had been between Ukraine and Russia, the core of the conflict at this point had been about nationalism, about you're Ukrainian, you're a Russian. And that was something where you could draw lines. And frankly, it was concerning to me because to see what was happening in Ukraine in the years before this. It's not, I mean, and this is where you say, it's like now it's like, you can't say anything bad about Ukraine right now. It's like, well, let me just put this in context. The Ukrainian government had been passing language policy that relegated Russian speakers to second-class citizenship because Ukraine's trying to figure out an ideology that unites folks, and it was resting on ethnic nationalism. My personal opinion is that ethnic nationalism needs to be gone. Anything that binds you to something you had nothing to do with and limits your belonging, limits your upbringing, anything that relegates others to second-class citizenship, to me, is fundamentally the antithesis of the Enlightenment and the principles that I think are most empowering to people.
But the West is, I see your point. I see your point, Ben. The West is in it for a little bit here, but we should think about what we're doing and keep it temporary to the specific conflict. Yeah, we're rooting for Ukraine. And we're thankful that they're united and everything, but there is behind that something to think about. I mean, other countries have certainly done. I mean, Quebec has done language laws. France has done language laws. I mean, there's a lot of people that want to fight for their culture and things like that.
Culture's different, though. Culture's different. Culture is something you can choose to embrace or choose not to. Now, it's hard, right? A language law is one thing. But when the language law is rooted in a history or a tradition, right? This is our tradition here. That's not immutable. That's not, you can't belong here. I mean, it's like the French, right? They're like, speak French here. Okay, yeah. That's still a civic nationalism, the same way we're like, speak English here. It has everything to do with like the idea that that's what we do here. It's not the idea that like immutably in our bloodline is this thing, and if you don't speak it, you are our enemy. But I will say this. So back to the question of the resistance, I knew the Ukrainians were going to fight because what the Russians were trying to do was to take land from them. Mm-hmm. Once I realized what it is, and this is no longer a battle between Russian ethnicity and Ukrainian ethnicity. This is a battle between this ideology that Putin is trying to force on the Ukrainians, that they're actually part of his own group. And this is why I'm saying it's off the charts. And in this, remember, you have Russia, or as known, Great Russia, Belarusia, White Russia, Belarus, and Malorussia, Little Russia. It is a diminutive status within this. But never when Putin's trying to force on them. At this point, they don't have to imagine themselves as Ukrainians to fight this new ideology, because it's simply of fighting against the imposition of a community that's being hoisted upon them and forced on them by Putin. And this is where the brilliance comes in, Bruce. And this is the last thing I'll say here.
Sure.
The brilliance comes in that there is now this moment where who's the national hero? Who will always, I think, for as long as we exist, be a national hero to Ukraine? It's Volodymyr Zelensky. And this is where I think that Putin, whatever happens with this, it's a tragedy. But when one of your national heroes is a Jewish native Russian speaker, your national story is going to be far more expansive because he is not of that bloodline. He is not a native speaker of that language. It is going to open up, I think, a new notion of what it means to be Ukrainian that's going to be far more beautiful.
I couldn't agree more. And I think if there are thoughts that you're probably uniquely qualified to answer as a comedian historian.
Yeah. Zelensky's representing us pretty well, too.
Well, I'm not as shocked by that as some, right? Comedians are thinkers, right? I mean, they're intense thinkers. They don't spend all their time joking around, right?
Well, they spend some of their time being horrible to each other. That's another side of it. But no.
But it takes an appreciation of life to be able to, that's why I'm not as shocked, And performance doesn't hurt either.
Yeah, no. And that's the thing with him. And it's weird, like to think about the idea of like, well, Trump was one of these people. No, Trump wasn't one of these people.
He could have been. He gave that up. I think he had. Sure, did he have some performance skills and it's being president and being a performer? I mean, Ronald Reagan. I mean, that's. I think it's everything you're saying goes to something very important for what's happened on the military. Neither of us are military historians. I get that, but we dabble a bit. I mean, I look at it and I say, when you go motivated troops And particularly to the point of, like you're saying, stealing your land, taking everything from you, no give. It's not going to be just a friendly little change of administration. You will take out 10 to 20 people in your room before they get you. That plus American help, drones and things like this.
Yes.
Buffoon, Russian soldiers doing the wrong thing, muddy roads, all of this stuff together, inadequate supplies and fuel problems, fighting in your own land where you know the territory, all of that stuff. You look at it, and the Russians, I look at it and say they simply do not have enough soldiers to conquer this country.
Well, they could get them. I mean, that's an issue, but they were ill prepared. I do want to say, though, I think grouping Trump in with Zelensky and Reagan is a problem. And this is actually really well, I've been convinced of this since a conversation a few years ago on the road to now with a historian named Catherine Kramer Brunel. She wrote a book called Showbiz Politics. And she said that comparing Trump to Reagan doesn't work in this way, because Reagan, like Zelensky, are actors. Actors have to work with the community. Everything's coordinated. You have to know how to play your role. You have to know how to play off other people. You were constantly working on a team. Mm-hmm. Trump was a reality star. And the values that make a good reality star is basically the potential to create chaos and create problems at every turn, because, entertainment is conflict resolution, right? A lot of it. And so that's the difference. Zelensky knows how to, I was telling Kelly, Zelensky knows how to stage a good talk. Mm-hmm. His team has and that to me is what's great about it. Like these images where he's in front of buildings where, they say, well, Zelensky's freed. And then him and his friends are standing around outside drinking coffee in Kyiv. And they're like, no, we haven't. I mean, it's so punchy, and they've won the propaganda war. And I don't know, the qualities he's learned as a performer are certainly instrumental to that, even though they alone wouldn't save him. Right. But his fortitude and everything. So I gotta give credit to that. As for the military aspect, yeah, I don't know. It is remarkable to me, because I kind of expected that the Russians would just go in and take over. But who was it? Did you see the defense minister of Ukraine wrote a thanks to tagged a bunch of oligarchs on Twitter and was thank them for squandering all of Russia's military budget?
Well, I go back to, I know they can maybe get soldiers or what have you. I do think they're going to run out. There's no limit to what you can militarize of your society. If they want to go full North Korea, maybe that's the angle here. But I do think you can, go back to World War I. The Germans, as far as I know, no French troops or American troops ever got into Germany that much. And yet Berlin surrenders.
Well, they starved him out.
Right? You can waste your stuff. You can starve out even in offense. You can get into Rumble in the Jungle type stuff where you're wearing yourself out, spending all the money. I mean, this could actually, it's never going to happen. But at some point you could, we'll actually surrender. It's not going to happen that way because Putin's not going to work that way. But it could happen in a form of some kind of negotiations we hope for the best. I
do too, but I don't know. I mean, I think in the same way the Ukrainians will never stop fighting, and I've said this from the beginning, they'll never stop fighting. But I don't know that Putin will either, because
they're in it.
If he really believes this story, as I'm more and more convinced he does, that this is somehow an inherent, timeless, primordial bloodline relationship, and that is the proper way the world should be, even if he has to back off now. If you're playing Empire and you go, I want a colony. You go, we lost. We'll get another colony maybe. But if you really have a true ideology that is yours and that the world has robbed you of it, and this is the story, that the West has robbed Russia and of its natural balance, which is why I think that he thought that Ukraine was going to fall so fast. I think Putin maybe really did believe that the vast majority of Ukrainians understood his vision of the world and believed in it, and that if he got rid of the fascist, and I should also add, drug addicts, he's been calling a lot of them, the word narcoman, which means Russian, it means drug addict in Russian, has been popping up in his speeches more and more. If you believe that, then you go, you get rid of the top, and then everybody's on your side.
This is another lesson among many things in the dangers of following propaganda. And we do it too in America, not to this extreme. I don't think anyone's invading, but stop thinking about your political opponents as just, getting high on your own supply, to use the drug term, and thinking you believed your own propaganda. Better to be a critical thinker, but of course we're on podcasts, so we're biased, right? But it's better to be a critical thinker because it's jumped off the page now with this invasion. Propaganda became utterly real.
So let your story follow the evidence, not the other way around. As I've said before, Bruce, I say this in my classes all the time. If you think you have the answer to a question before you've actually looked at the question, you don't have a science. You have a religion. And if your religion is Christianity, Islam, Hindu, any of that, I'm with you. I support you. But if your religion is Republican or Democrat, capitalist or communist, neo-Tsarist, right? No, I'm not with you on that. These things are all subject to the stuff of life is subject to criticism, to refinement. We should all be pursuing the best conclusions. And yeah, I love that parallel, because you're right. It's just like, I've told a story. Here's the story, is the truth, and anything that doesn't fit it is either a lie or illegitimate.
It's and then you go back to, hey, it was a country for 30 years. So whatever it is, this is one where I'll actually bat the history down a bit and say, whatever the history is, at present, it was a country and you entered it, without an invitation.
Yeah. And so the history weighs heavily on this stuff. I mean, my whole thing has been, I get it. Like if your name to another country that has a history of, subjugating your people, if your name can be interpreted, whether or not it's the actual origins of it, if it can be interpreted as being on the cusp of something, and our most immediate experience of being on the cusp of something is being on the edges of the Soviet Union, and now being tried to be forced back into the edges of the Russian Empire by Putin. Okay, don't call it the Ukraine, right? Because whatever the there's historical legacy matters, but at the same time, for me, it's what do you want me to call you? If evoking that historical legacy, which has created real problems for you right now, if that is an issue that your group of people feel is not respectful, okay, I'm going to follow you on it.
Yeah, I think we both do history podcasts. I'll be the first to say, can't be absolutist about it. Then you're just like a guy wearing a wig to work in a 21st century office. It doesn't, well, unless it's a modern way, it doesn't work. This isn't what history, it's not absolutism. It's just one tool to use that we tried to use well to get some of the interpretation. Well, anyway, Ben Sawyer, great having you on. Road to Now podcast. Where can people find it?
Wherever you're listening to My History Can Beat Up Your Politics right now, you could go there. Or, I wouldn't blame you if you did this, just go listen to more episodes of My History Can Beat Up Your Politics. As someone who listens to this podcast, it's kind of cool to be on it. But also, I got to say, kind of disappointing, because I'm not going to be able to listen to this episode because it'll just be me talking, and I hear enough of that already.
Oh, you don't listen to yourself?
Oh, I listen to myself all the time. Yeah. Oh my God. Having to edit lectures during the quarantine, having to listen to my own stand-up comedy back, having to just edit my own episodes of my podcast.
I wait a week. The edit doesn't count. The edit itself isn't the same as the 3 weeks later. I listened 3 weeks later. Well, Ben, great having you on. We'll get back in touch with you more when I get into the Soviet, because now I can tell we'll definitely have a lot to say. I want to thank Ben Sawyer for coming on the program today. A couple of things. Check out his article in the Washington Post. Also, the Road to Now podcast. Find it on Apple Podcasts, wherever you get podcasts. If you're listening to this program, you really should be listening to them. They cover a lot of topics, and they talk to a lot of interesting folks. If you like music, well, who doesn't like music? If you like a particular... If you like the Avett Brothers, Bob Crawford that he does the podcast with is a member of that band. And sometimes members of the Avett Brothers come on, and they're highly intelligent people that really, speak to a lot of topics. It's a good program. Okay. Our website is www.myhistorycanbeatupyourpolitics.com. There are many archived episodes at that website. If you want to support the program, we have a Patreon, patreon.com/MHCBUYP. And thanks for listening.